In this video we will begin a series of videos that constitute an introduction to musical intervals, an extremely important aspect in the study of music. This first video covers the definitions and nomenclature used for these intervals. The second video will help you become familiar with the sound of these intervals, and the third video will help you identify them by associating each one with some melodies. On the left side of the screen is shown the table summarizing the specifications of each of the intervals, and on the right side the chromatic scale starting at the note C. In the diagram on the right, the arrows pointing to the left are pointing towards lower frequencies, and we will say that they are pointing in a downward direction. On the contrary, the arrows in the diagram pointing to the right point to higher frequencies, and we will say that they do so in an upward direction. In the first of the rows above the chromatic scale, the intervals corresponding to the 7 natural notes defined in the theory of music in Western culture are considered. These 7 notes constitute the C major scale, the most important scale in the theory, and which establishes here the reference for the specification of the intervals. 2 groups are shown, those colored in red, on the 1st, 4th, 5th, and 8th degrees, which define the perfect intervals. Thus, we have the perfect unison interval, a repetition of the initial C. The perfect 4th interval, with an extension of 5 semitones. The perfect 5th interval, with an extension of 7 semitones. The perfect octave interval, with an extension of 12 semitones. The references colored in blue on the 2nd, 3rd, 6th, and 11th degrees define the major intervals. Thus we have the major 2nd interval, with an extension of 2 semitones. The major 3rd interval, with an extension of 4 semitones. The major 6th interval, with an extension of 9 semitones. And the major 7th interval, with an extension of 11 semitones. With the major 7th interval, the intervals corresponding to the natural notes have been completed. Let us now consider the intervals corresponding to the remaining 5 notes, which have been represented in the scale as the result of increasing the frequency of natural notes by 1 semitone to obtain sharp notes. This alteration has been represented in the scale diagram by green arrows, and gives rise to augmented intervals. This results in the following intervals. The augmented unison interval, with an extension of 1 semitone. The augmented 2nd interval, with an extension of 3 semitones. The augmented 4th interval, with an extension of 6 semitones. The augmented 5th interval, with an extension of 8 semitones. The augmented 6th interval, with an extension of 10 semitones. With the augmented 6th interval, we have an interval for each of the 12 possible interval lengths over an octave. However, it should be noted that the extension of the major 3rd interval by 1 semitone gives rise to an alternative name for the perfect 4th interval, augmented 3rd interval. The same is true for the major 7th interval, whose extension gives rise to the alternative designation of augmented 7th for the perfect octave interval. Note that the process of interval widening has been represented by arrows in ascending direction identified by the initial letter A for augmented, and has given rise to new alternative denominations for the perfect 4th and octave intervals. However, alternative names for the rest of the intervals can be generated by reducing the extension of other intervals, a process represented in the diagram by arrows going downwards. The magenta arrows generate minor intervals by reducing a semitone in major intervals and are identified by the letter M, initial of minor. Thus we have the minor 2nd, 3rd, 6th, and 7th intervals. The brown arrows identified by the letter D, initial of diminished, generate diminished intervals by reducing a semitone in perfect intervals. Thus we have the diminished fourth, fifth, and octave intervals. The brown arrows identified by double D generate diminished intervals by reducing two semitones in major intervals. Thus we have the double diminished second, third, sixth, and seventh intervals. The diagram associated with the chromatic scale used in the presentation is useful to visualize the origin of the nomenclature used, but it can be summarized in the following rules. The first, fourth, fifth, and eighth degrees correspond to perfect intervals. The second, third, sixth, and seventh degrees correspond to major intervals. The increase in one semitone of the perfect and major intervals leads to augmented intervals. The reduction of minor intervals by one semitone leads to diminished intervals. The reduction of the major intervals by two semitones leads to doubly diminished intervals. Thank you for watching this video. We hope you find the information provided very useful. In the next video of this series dedicated to the study of intervals, you will be able to listen to the sound of each interval, appreciate their degree of consonance, and learn about some of their common uses.